Welcome to Unraveling Behavior, a science podcast from the Max Planck Institute for Human Development. Hello, everyone. Today, we're diving into the psychology of big, life-changing decisions. The ones that can completely change who we are, like deciding to become a parent or making a big career change. Joining us is Shahar Hechtlinger, a PhD candidate in psychology at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development. We'll explore what an ideal decision maker would want to know to make the perfect choice. And from there, we'll get real about the strategies people may actually use with the information they have. So, let's dive into my conversation with Shahar Hechtlinger. Welcome, Shahar. It's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you so much, Sophia. It's great being here.
When people hear the term transformative life decisions, right, they often think of choices that change who they are or alter the course of their lives. Is this also how you understand them?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is, I think, a very easy way of understanding those decisions. Very intuitive. Of course, we identify them in different ways, but I think for sort of understanding what it is really that we talk about, this is a great way to do it. So those are decisions that often can really change what it is like to be a person, so what it's like to be you, and they can manifest in very different areas of life. So sometimes these can be things like moving to another country, making a big career change, becoming a parent, but it can also be things that only some of us face sometime in life. Things like reporting a sexual assault or rape, whistleblowing on an institution or person, really anything that puts a person in a point of sort of no return.
The consequences of these decisions, they don't need to be necessarily negative, right? They can also be positive.
Yeah, the change can be perceived as positive, as negative, or most likely a little bit of both, right? So when we are facing a decision, we often, part of the reason why we are not sure is because some of the consequences can be good and some of them can be bad, and we're not sure really how we will experience them. So this is a very important part of transformative decision making.
And I can imagine that the circumstances that individuals find themselves in is also an important variable here, right? The same decision can be transformative for one individual, but not for another, depending on their circumstances.
Yeah, absolutely. So basically, the very same decision can be even not a decision for someone else. So let's take an example again, the example of becoming a parent. For many people, it's not even a choice. So in some countries and also for some individuals around the world, this is not really a choice. They become pregnant and they have a child. But in more Western societies, we see this position of having a choice about this. And this is relatively new in history. This is one example. Or you take the Me Too movement, right? We talked about reporting assault or rape. This is also something that is relatively new and only became an option even with history developing, right? Because when women didn't even have a right to vote, let alone report sexual misconduct, it was not even possible to imagine this decision. So absolutely, it changes between people right now in the present, depending on their circumstances. These were just a few examples, and also across history.
So in your PhD research, you're exploring how people make transformative life decisions. Could you give us like a quick overview of what the scientific literature says about this so far?
So this can be very short, not much, right? So we really don't know much about this question. And the emphasis here is on the how question, right? So what we look at is what we call a descriptive question. So we want to understand how people make decisions. And this is different than a normative question that asks how people should be making decisions or how idealized agents should make decisions. This is important, this distinction, because most of what we know about transformative life decisions comes from normative views. So views mainly in philosophy, but also in cognitive science, that ask this question, how should we make those decisions? With regards to the descriptive question, so how do we make these decisions? We really don't know much. Most of what we know about how people make decisions, and we do know a lot, it comes from studies that look at smaller decisions. So either some kind of experimental paradigm. What is very often studied, for instance, is monetary gambles. And we know really a lot about how people make decisions in those simplified scenarios. And also, we do know a bit about what people are doing outside the lab. But we really don't know much. So this really hasn't been studied, how people make those decisions that can transform them, the people, and their lives.
So I suggest that we start by discussing the normative approach, because you were saying this is also where most work has been done in transformative life decision-making, and then transition into how this connects to your own descriptive work. And according to theories of rational choice, decision makers should aspire to follow the expected utility model. Could you explain the key steps of this model?
So imagine that you are thinking about going on a picnic. So you have a couple of options, right, on how to act. You can go outside, you can stay home. Let's say you just have those two options. Now, there are also a couple of states of the world, so-called, that can occur. So it might be that it will be a really nice day, very sunny, and hence you will probably very much enjoy being outside on a picnic. It might also rain.
Which would be terrible.
That would really not be nice because, everything will be wet. And of course, you can also stay home. This is maybe the most known safe option. Now, you more or less, in the case of going on a picnic, you can check the weather forecast, right? You can assign some kind of probability to the events of rain and no rain, let's put it like this. You can also, because you've been on picnics before, you know more or less how much you are likely to enjoy this. So basically, let's say you give a number of how happy you will be going on the picnic.
And that's the so-called utility.
That's the so-called utility, exactly.
So an indication of how much you think going on a picnic would contribute to your satisfaction, how much you would enjoy it.
Yeah. I mean, utility can be many things. I mean, a lot has been written on what it is exactly. But let's say it's something like satisfaction, contribution to well-being, happiness, something like that. And so you assess in each state of the world, let's say picnic with sun, picnic with rain, staying at home, how happy you will be, how satisfied you will be in this case. And let's say you attach a number to it. Okay, so you have a set of numbers, you have a set of probabilities of how likely those cases are, and then you multiply them. Okay? And then what ends up being the option with the highest number, the highest utility, this is what you will end up doing if you're a rational agent, according to expected utility theory. Here we're talking about subjective expected utility, where the agent themselves assigns the probabilities.
It is well known that this model has its limits as a tool for everyday decision-making, right? Even Savage, who was one of the main developers of this model, he had already pointed out that we often don't know all the outcomes of our decisions, or even how likely they are to occur. So if you go on a picnic, for example, many other things can happen in addition to rainy weather or sunny weather, right? I mean, you can be stung by a wasp or lose your wallet.
But also, let's not focus only on the bad. Also, some good things can happen. Like, I don't know, you find yourself picnicking next to your favorite rock band. Yeah, but the point is that those things that happen in real life, they are not accounted for in those very simplified models. And this was termed by Herbert Simon unanticipated consequences.
In the case of transformative life decisions, things get even a little bit more complicated. Philosopher Laurie Paul has taken this a step further, arguing that these decisions pose an even greater challenge to the expected utility model. Could you explain us why this is the case, perhaps using an example of a transformative life decision?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm not sure if it's a greater challenge, but it's definitely a different kind of challenge that was not the focus of decision theory before. So what Laurie Paul is saying is, okay, we understand we can't sometimes know the consequences, but this is in the world. What was still assumed in those rational choice models is that we can always assign the utilities, right? So we always know how happy, satisfied, how much value we will have from each option. What Laurie Paul is saying, which she has developed in her very influential book, Transformative Experience, is that some experiences, when we face choices about them, we need to think about many more things that have to do not just with the situation, but with our own subjectivity. Meaning, some experiences like becoming a parent. This is one of her sort of canonical examples. When we think about them before undergoing the experience, we can spend a lot of time imagining what it would be like to become a parent. We can talk to people. We can do all sorts of things to inform ourselves about the experience. But what we can't know is how this experience would feel for us, because we have never done something as similar to that, even if we've been babysitting or watching other people's kids. Nothing is really the same as having your own child, and such a massive change that Laurie Paul claims this is an epistemically transformative experience. Epistemically transformative meaning that we cannot know how it feels like to undergo it before actually experiencing it. And this is a kind of uncertainty or ignorance that was not accounted for before in utility models. So she's saying, okay, this is one thing that is really important about those kinds of experiences. But as we started with the intuition that what is really the core of those decisions is the personal transformation, right? This is what people think about when they think about those decisions. And this is the other part of Laurie Paul's account of transformative experiences, the personally transformative experiences. So not only that becoming a parent, for instance, changes what it is like to have the experience, it also changes you as a person. So it can change you to the very core.
Like your values.
By changing your values, it might be your personality, but mainly what you value as a person. So when you are at the point of choice, if you try to assign those utility values, you just don't know.
This brings us to this idea of mental simulation, right, in Laurie Paul's work. So the idea, as I understand it, is that as a consequence of these experiences being epistemically and personally transformative, it is not possible for you today as a decision maker to run this accurate simulation of yourself in the future, given that you have made a certain decision. Is this correct?
Yeah, Yeah, so basically how the argument works, so we have those transformative experiences, right? We just explained what is epistemically transformative and what is personally transformative. And we have the utility, the expected utility model. And in Laurie Paul's argument, the reason why we cannot make rational decisions about transformative experiences, taking that what is rational is expected utility theory, is because if we want to make those decisions by sort of imagining what it would be like to undergo the experiences, which is often what people in the Western world think about, like we should do things that we really want to do and that we feel like would be good for us, then if this is the way we want to make those decisions, simulating what it would be like to have the experiences, right? Like we did with maybe the picnic, maybe with when you pick an ice cream, you imagine, oh, would I like this? Would I not like? This is a very intuitive way of thinking about preferential choice. So if this is how we want to be making these decisions, and we are facing decisions about experiences that can change what it's like to be us, and we don't know how they would feel like. So it's really in this thing that we cannot do it. Of course, all the limitations that we mentioned before from Savage and Simon and people also apply here, right? So this is important to say. It's just an additional challenge that Laurie Paul has pointed to that was not acknowledged before.
Now let's take a case of a person that decides to remain childless. Can this still be considered a transformative decision?
Yeah, so in our view, yes. The moment of decision-making happens before any transformation. And if you consider transformation, this is already a transformative decision. So a transformative experience doesn't have to occur in order for the decision to be considered transformative. Okay, so this, in our view, how we see it, and this is also why our focus is on the decision-making part and not on the experiencing part. Because a lot of things can happen after you make your decision, right? There's a lot of uncertainty. So what you thought might happen might not happen. Partly the part about transformation, so personal and epistemic transformation. So it can go both ways. So decisions can transform you more than you thought they would, but they can also transform you less than you thought they would. And what really counts, in our view, is the moment of, or the period of making the choice. So the consideration of something that is transformative. And if someone chose to remain childless after considering whether or not to remain childless or whether to become a parent, then this could still be a transformative decision.
So I'd like to share some quotes from Laurie Paul's appearance in the EconTalk podcast to help connect her insights to your own work. Is that okay?
Of course.
Yeah.
I always love hearing from Laurie.
She said, I want us to recognize what we can do and what we can't do, what we can know and what we can't know, not set ourselves impossible tasks. So take a stance involving epistemic humility, and then from that stance, look at what kinds of decision models we might be able to build. She also said, my hope is that we do a better job at recognizing the challenges that we face and then expand our research and our thinking so that we can try to handle them. How do you see these insights connecting to your own research?
Yeah, I really love this quote. I think this is a great way to bridge Laurie Paul's work, the emphasis on more normative understanding of transformative life decisions, into really the question of how people make them. So what we basically understand from Paul's work is that it's impossible to if we want to use some kind of mental simulation and we want to make decisions about transformative experiences, it's impossible to make them. But then there's still the question of, so how do we do it, right? Because a lot of people actually make those decisions in real life. And this is basically the place where our work starts. So we say, okay, this doesn't work in the classical norms of utility theory, but people still make those decisions all the time. So how do they make them? And maybe we need to change our view on what rationality means in order to understand them, because maybe people can make them rationally. Just rationality would not mean exactly the same thing as it is in expected utility theory. As we said before, we know quite a lot about how people make decisions. Maybe not the biggest decisions, but as we said, there's uncertainty everywhere. So even in the smaller decisions, there is uncertainty. So our approach goes in this direction and bases itself on a very long history of research on strategies that can work in many different decision situations. We basically take this approach and adapt it to transformative life decisions. So we identify what is unique or what are the key characteristics of transformative life decisions. And then, according to those characteristics, we identify a set of strategies that address those situational characteristics.
This brings us to a conceptual framework, right, that you propose in a conceptual article you co-authored with Christine Schulze, Christina Leuker, and Ralph Hertwig, which has just very recently been published in the journal American Psychologist. The steps, this framework has, say, 3 main steps, as you were saying, right? First, you identify the properties, the characteristics of the decision situation, and then you use these properties to sort of generate hypotheses about what strategies people might apply in those situations. And how about this text-based approach that you use to find examples of strategies?
You can imagine it's quite hard to take transformative life decisions and put them in a lab setting, like you study monetary gambles, for instance. Inherent to our approach already here when it's conceptual, right? We still don't present our own data, so no empirical data in this paper, but we already thought a lot about how one can go about studying those decisions, because this is the point, maybe the main motivation behind this paper, to sort of set the groundwork to be able to study those decisions. Since all of us are making those decisions and they are very important to us, they are not just things that we do and forget about. We can find traces of transformative life decisions in culture. So when we look at printed books, when we look at blog posts, when we look at news articles, they are all over. They're really all over.
So traces of the decision-making process that people used.
Yeah, so both the approach, but also the mention of those big life decisions.
Like the challenges they faced.
Exactly. So this is quite a rich array of descriptions of both the decision situation, which is the first thing that we were interested in, right? And also of how people faced them. So what did they do? What did they think about? So when we say text-based approach, we're basically saying that we had a very deep look at sources like this, like the ones that I mentioned, and really read a lot and picked examples that let the properties and the strategies that we identified shine.
So one property of transformative decisions that you discuss in your paper is the change of self. And you mentioned that when people anticipate a significant change in who they are, they face a dilemma. Could you explain what this dilemma is about and what sort of strategies people might use to tackle this dilemma?
So first of all, this again goes back and connects very well with work that has been done in philosophy, right? So we talked about Laurie Paul's work, but also work by another philosopher, Edna Ullmann-Margalit, who also wrote about core affecting decisions and transformative decisions. When we are facing the decision, there's often the prospect of many changes to occur. So this can be psychological changes, this can be physical changes. Imagine a bariatric surgery that one is considering, or it can also be both physical and psychological changes, like in the case of becoming a parent. What the person needs to do is to sort of, if you want to use the old utility frameworks, you need to anticipate all of that, right? And you need to know how exactly you will change. And since you can't do that, you basically need to bet on a certain version of yourself. So what can often happen is that we imagine some kind of ideal self and we have this image in mind and we can choose from the perspective of this ideal self. Or we imagine ourselves at the end of life or in 10 years from now or whatnot. And we try to take the perspective of this self. So basically, if you want to put it in a dilemma, from the perspective of which self do we want to choose? Is it from the perspective of the current self only? Is it from the perspective of some kind of future or ideal self?
I find this interesting because on one hand, is the current self that makes the decision. So, and you want to be authentic, right? You want to decide for yourself with your own mind. But in the end, it is my future self that will deal with the consequences of what I decide today. So you could even say, well, forget about your current self altogether and just decide based on what a potential future self would want.
Right. And a lot of strategies actually do take the perspective of the current self, so many of them. But there are also a few strategies that we mention and develop that take this different perspective of either a future or an ideal self.
In your paper, you have the situation of the story of this Iranian judo athlete.
Yeah, Saeid Mollaei.
Would you like to explain that? What happened to him?
So he was in a judo competition, and Iranian athletes, they have often this unwritten rule dictated to them that whenever there's an Israeli opponent, they need to withdraw from competition. And Mollaei had his lifelong dream at stake of becoming an Olympic champion. And basically, this dream led him to decide to not withdraw from competition, and he disregarded any other considerations that may have been or were very important, like his safety, the safety of his family. He basically put everything at stake for this ideal self that has the goal and wants to become an Olympic champion.
In your paper, you describe a second strategy that people could also use to avoid having to make this trade-off between current and future self, which is to make a choice that the future self won't regret, right? And you cite the case of Jeff Bezos.
I think some people may know this example because it's quite popular in culture. So basically, when Jeff Bezos, he had a steady job. So he was he was employed in a good company and was rather okay with the situation. But he had this idea of starting an internet-based company, and the process which he describes is what we then coin with the name minimax inaction regret. Minimax is the part about minimizing. Regret is regret. We want to minimize regret. And the inaction part talks about specifically minimizing regret from inaction. Why? So there are a lot of models that talk about minimizing regret. What especially here is the emphasis on inaction. And we know from quite broad literature that what people regret in the short term is actions. So things that they do. I don't know if you think about what you ate for lunch. Oh, I should have eaten something healthier, or I should have done this workout. I should have called my mom, and so on and so forth. But then when you look at the long term, what people regret most is inaction, things they did not do, which is striking, right? So people regret missed opportunities for relationships, time they did not spend
with their loved ones.
Exactly. And also business opportunities. When you look at Jeff Bezos' description of how he made the choice, you very much see a structure which fits very well to minimax inaction regret. So first you ask yourself, in X years, so in his case, I think he, if I'm not mistaken, he was talking about when I'm 80 years old, so really, really old, will I regret doing this? And then he gives himself an answer based on this, yes or no. It's simple. You don't have to calculate anything, any utilities, nothing. Okay, if you give yourself the yes answer, it's done. It's done there. You don't do it. But if the answer is no, I'm not going to regret doing that, then you move on and ask, will I regret not doing this? So will this be a missed opportunity for my future self? Now, of course, you might be wrong, right? So you need to bet on something being informative. So here the bet is on your imagining the future self being somewhat true to what will actually be. But this is the case for any decision strategy. Then if you get the answer, yes, I will regret this, then you should do it. So this is what the policy of minimax inaction regret sort of dictates.
And in the case of Jeff Bezos, so he reported that he would have regretted not starting the new business.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, we all know how the story goes.
Yes. Another property of transformative decisions that I'd like us to discuss is that some of them are expensive to undo, or even impossible to change once they've made. Could you explain how the strategy known as testing the waters can help minimize the costs of reversing a decision?
Really, a lot of things are irreversible per se, right? So you can't, even with your lunch, you can't uneat it. But this is not really what we are talking about, right? So we are talking about, as you mentioned, things that really have either very high reversal costs or take forever to reverse, or are literally not possible to reverse. So if you think about things like gender affirming surgery, I mean, you can try to undo it, but I don't think this is really possible. Hormone therapy as well. Once the voice changes, there is no going back. And
having a child.
Having a child, of course.
Even moving to another country, to move back, it also has some costs associated.
Exactly.
You can do it, but...
Yeah, you can often go back, not in all cases, right? Sometimes if you flee war or a totalitarian regime, then you actually can't go back. But even if you can, and you just move between countries in Europe, there are still quite high costs attached to this act. Now, with testing the waters, this is a strategy that faces this perceived irreversibility head on and tries to find the setting in which the decision you are thinking about has the least irreversible consequences. Okay, so you basically try to find a test environment. So if you're thinking about, for instance, coming out, you can start by dropping hints and not really saying anything and wait for a response. And then you adjust your steps based on responses that you get from the environment. You can also then, for instance, in this same example, tell a few trusted individuals before telling people that are in a larger circle. So the idea is always to sort of keep a controlled setting. If feedback is positive, you continue in a less controlled setting. And if feedback is negative, you try to find a different controlled setting. And if this is not possible, you are even stopping the process altogether. So you really dip your toes and then go step by step.
And in your article, you also mention an interesting case, the case of Christine Blasey Ford, that also applied the testing the water strategy when disclosing a sexual assault. Can you describe how her story was?
So first of all, just a disclaimer, all the cases we're talking about, we reconstruct the decision-making process, right? So it might be also that they did something slightly different, but from the evidence that we find, we believe that her process, her initial process, can be quite accurately described as testing the waters. She was living quite a serene life when she realized that the guy who sexually assaulted her many years before that was being nominated for a Supreme Court spot. And this started a sequence of deliberation processes that took her quite a while, considering whether to come forward. And to keep her identity secret in those earlier stages, she took very controlled steps. So things like talking to a journalist, but doing it through a tip line. So basically keeping her anonymity. Then taking another step and writing a letter to a senator on the Judiciary Committee, and so on and so forth. So it was really like at each step there was a little bit more revealing of her identity, but in a very controlled way, so that she and her family is kept safe. Eventually, this backfired also, because her identity was revealed without her consent. But still, from the decision-making perspective, this initial part of the process, she eventually also used another strategy to make the final choice, is sort of a classic case of testing the waters.
So the last property of transformative decisions I'd like to discuss is conflicting cues or reasons. Can you explain what this means and how the strategy elimination by aspects works in the situation?
Many choices, not just transformative life decisions, present us with conflicts, right? So going back to the ice cream shop, even there, most people would assume that they can't have it all. Like they're not going to taste all the ice cream flavors in the shop, at least not in one day. And you face some kind of small, but for children, maybe even a significant conflict. You need to choose between chocolate and vanilla and fruit. And like there are so many things to choose from. And there might be things that you care about more or less. Now, when we talk about the really important decisions in life, those conflicts can often be between things that are incommensurable, which means that those are things like our values. It's often really the things we value the most that cannot be compared on the same metric. So it's not like those are all tastes of ice cream and we can compare them in some kind of way. It can be things like our freedom and someone else's, like the value of friendship or family values in the case of Mollaei, which we discussed before, and his goal to be an Olympian. So things that are so substantial and so important to us that any goal to try to compare them like that basically fails.
And conflicting means that when they conflict, it means that you are in a situation where you can't have both.
Often what happens is that one option represents one side of this conflict and another option represents the other.
And how does the strategy elimination by aspects help people tackle the situation of conflicting cues?
Basically, what it does is avoid having to make any trade-offs between alternatives, and it uses quite intuitive process of elimination. So basically, if we take the example of moving, for instance, let's say there are a few countries from which you need to choose or want to choose where to move to. There are a couple of things that are important for you about those choices. But then with elimination by aspects, you don't have to go and do the sort of impossible and try to compare it all at once, right? So what you do is start with the most important aspect. I don't know, you want to be close to your family. So this already eliminates some alternatives. And then let's say the next thing is having good job opportunities. So it eliminates more, and so on and so forth, until you are left with just one option. And this process is non-compensatory, so meaning it doesn't make trade-offs because it follows this process of elimination. Now, when we say that, someone might say, but you still need to rank those aspects by importance, so you do make a comparison. But here we're talking about what is called a weak order. It's not a full-on trade-off between like we had in the utility case.
I know that you're currently looking into the strategies that people use to make transformative life decisions. Can you give us a quick overview of that study and perhaps just a sneak peek into the most interesting findings?
Yeah, very happy to. And basically, we took this framework that we just talked about, and of course, we only had a taste of the framework, right? So we talked about a couple of examples, but we have a framework with 5 of those properties and many of potential strategies that people use. But of course, this still begs the question of, okay, we went another step to say how people can make those decisions, but we still don't know how they really make them. Does it go in line with what we propose here? Do they actually use quite simple strategies to make those decisions? Or maybe people actually try to do something that is more like maximizing at the end of the day, right? Because after all, these are the most important decisions in their lives. If they don't maximize there, where would they do it? We tested all of this empirically. We asked around 1,000 people in the UK to report big important life decisions in the last 2 years. And first of all, we find that very much in line with what we've discussed before, it is very common. So it's a common phenomenon. It's not out of this world type of thing. People make those decisions really all the time.
Can you give examples of decisions that they report having made?
So the most frequent ones were in the domains of family relationships, migration, and everything that has to do with work and career. So things like changing jobs, retiring. We had a representative sample, so we also sampled older adults. Becoming parents was not extremely frequent because it's a representative sample, but we also saw evidence for that. Moving was very, very frequent. So relocating either within the country or going abroad. But we also, of course, saw more idiosyncratic decisions that not many people reported, but are also very important. Going back to the beginning, we said, right, one thing can be transformative to one person and not for another. And also social setting defines a lot of it.
And in this study, what did you find? Do people report using simpler strategies or more complex ones?
We mostly found confirmation for our theory, meaning that the majority of people use simpler strategies, often ones that are characterized in our framework. So non-compensatory strategies that don't make any trade-offs at all. But the interesting part is that you still see a trace of people's wish to maximize, because we didn't always only ask people to report how they made decisions, but also how they would recommend someone else to make the exact same decision. And there we saw this pattern flip, meaning that when people were asked to recommend, the majority of them recommended compensatory, more complex strategies that are more in line with the maximizing idea. So mostly not full on expected utility with all of the intricacies, but something that goes in that direction. So making trade-offs. So I find this a very interesting pattern, because although in a way people at least unconsciously understand that they cannot make these decisions in the expected utility kind of way, they still have this wish to be doing it in a more maximizing way.
Where do you think this comes from?
I mean, this study was conducted in the UK, so West. I am curious to find out if this is really cultural. So if this tendency to, or this wish to maximize is something that we will only see in the West or not. So I think it might as well be culture. I think another part is really the stakes involved, that when you have those high stakes, you just really want to exhaust every possibility and make all possible comparisons, and people imagine tables and whatnot. But at the end of the day, as we've covered quite nicely, I think today, there is so much uncertainty about the world, about yourself, that sometimes the only way to go is really by using very simple strategies that address the real world conditions in which we make those very influential decisions.
Do you think it might also be fear of regret that makes people prefer or recommend a more complex approach to decision making? That you could say in the future, regardless of how things turn out for you, regardless the consequences, you can say, well, I did the best I could.
I mean, I don't have data to back this up, so I would need to speculate, but I think this might as well be the case. It might also be fear of regret. Although we do know that both the people who used more compensatory and non-compensatory strategies they don't regret much. So I think this has a lot to do with the fact that it's often irreversible. So you need to, even if you might not be the happiest, you find a way to rationalize maybe, or explain to yourself why the situation is actually preferable, and so on and so forth. But these are speculations.
So one last question for you, Shahar. To what extent do you think that research on transformative life decisions can actually empower decision makers?
As I said, we are in the very beginning, right? So there's a lot we still don't know. But I think with gathering more and more knowledge on how people really face those decisions, and already even with the conceptual framework, I think people can gain much more insight on what is it exactly that they do. So can they sort of put themselves into any of these strategies and understanding their decision situation? I think it can also be influential for practitioners, people that aid decision makers in making those life transitions. These are often topics that come up in counseling, coaching, and so on. I hope that this is the beginning of a path that can also, at the end, empower people, because this is really the main goal, right? We want to understand this not just for curiosity, but to be able to help people make decisions they are happier with.
And do you think that actually the simple awareness that there are certain things there are things you just can't know, possibly that this awareness can also be helpful?
So I think that for me, at least, I can speak from my personal perspective. For me, that was maybe the most valuable lessons in getting into this topic. I think it gives you freedom and also humility, because you can't know everything. Some things are just out of our control, and acknowledging that, I think, is a lot.
Shahar, I want to thank you for sharing your expertise, for being here today. It was a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Sophia. It was lovely.
Dear audience, thanks for tuning in to today's conversation with Shahar Hechtlinger. Recognizing that some things are beyond our ability to know can be empowering when making transformative life decisions. Instead of attempting impossible tasks, we can focus on simpler strategies, ones that work with the information we have. If you are interested in exploring more on this topic, check out the show notes on our website at unravelingbehavior.org. Thank you for your interest in science. See you soon.